Members, the House is resumed. Before the dinner break, we were on the second reading of the Taxation Bright Line Test for Residential Land Bill, and Stuart Nash had the call and has 3 minutes 30 seconds remaining if he wishes.
I do indeed, Mr. Speaker.
Stuart Nash.
Mr. Speaker, I think what I was saying is that the Parliament needs to consider tax legislation very carefully before it brings it into the House, and certainly before it takes it out to the general public. And, Mr. Speaker, the point that I was making is that there were a number of submitters, including the Chartered Accountants of Australia and New Zealand, the New Zealand Law Society, KPMG, etc., who actually came and presented to the Select Committee and told us that this was not good legislation. They told us that this legislation was piecemeal, that it would not solve the problems, that better enforcement of existing rules would be preferable to the Bright Line test, that the burden of proof already existed with the taxpayer, that the Bright Line test would only tax those who are forced to sell the property due to circumstances outside of their control. The bottom line, Mr. Speaker, as I've mentioned, as Grant Robertson mentioned before me, is that we are supporting this legislation, but we are very critical of the fact that this could have been so much better. In fact, the IRD, as I mentioned, put forward two options for consideration when they were deliberating on this bill. The first one was the one we're debating at the moment, which was a 2-year Bright Line test. The second one was a 5-year test. And, Mr. Speaker, we think that that would have captured by far a much higher percentage of investors who are seeking to make profits in this market without paying any tax, and in fact distorting the property market. There is no doubt, Mr. Speaker, that something needs to be done about the Auckland housing market. There is no doubt, Mr. Speaker, it is under control at this point in time. But if the honourable member believes that putting a 2-year Bright Line test is going to solve the problems of the Auckland housing market, then, Mr. Speaker, I suggest she stop taking as much 1080 as she is and start getting with the picture. Because, Mr. Speaker, it requires a lot more than this sort of rust, poll-driven political legislation, as opposed to a pragmatic solution that would have dealt with the problem we are facing in Auckland at this point in time. And it is good to see that that member reads the left-wing blogs. I would have thought she would have had a lot better to do than that. Mr. Speaker, part of the problem we've got at the moment is we have a test called the intention test. And, Mr. Speaker, this legislation just goes to show that the intention test is not working. Mr. Speaker, this piece of legislation is sort of a tarpaulin that's supposed to cover over the inadequacies of the intention test. What that test is about is that if an investor buys a property with the express purpose of making a capital gain, then they have got to pay tax when they sell it. But, Mr. Speaker, if an investor buys a property with the intention of getting a rental yield, then when they sell that property, they do not have to pay tax. So, Mr. Speaker, even though Labor is supporting this legislation, I hope the House does not view this as support for the measures that the government is taking to do something to address the major issues that affect the Auckland housing market. Thank you very much.
Kia ora.